In mountaineering, there are 3 rules for survival: return home, return with friends, reach the summit, in that order. Hayden Kennedy, a world-renowned mountaineer, formulated these rules himself during a lecture in 2015. 2 years later, in the mountains of Montana, he found himself in a situation where it was impossible to follow his own principles. What happened that day proved that sometimes the mountains take not only lives, but also the will to live from those who survive. Hayden Kennedy was a rising star in the world of mountaineering. At the age of 27, the son of legendary climber Michael Kennedy had already made legendary ascents in Patagonia and Pakistan, receiving a prestigious award in world mountaineering. But Hayden was not just a talented athlete. He became a philosopher of the mountains, a preacher of pure mountaineering, climbing without artificial simplifications. Inga Perkins was his complete opposite. A modest math student at the University of Montana, she dreamed of becoming a teacher and shunned publicity, preferring handwritten letters to social media. But behind this modesty lay an incredibly strong climber who made outstanding ascents and inspired everyone around her. Fate brought them together in 2015 at a festival in Lander. By 2017, they were living together in Bozeman, Montana, consciously moving away from their superstar careers to a simpler life. Inga was finishing her studies. Hayden was training to become a paramedic. They were united by their love of the mountains and their desire for authenticity in a world obsessed with achievement. On the morning of October 7, 2017, Hayden checked his equipment one last time. Avalanche beacons, probes, shovels. Everything was ready for the descent from Imp Peak. Inga, his partner in life and in the mountains, was gathering nearby. They planned to traverse the North Couloir, a route they knew by heart from Thomas Turiano's guidebook. The weather was clear in the Montana mountains. Nothing foreshadowed the tragedy that would destroy 2 lives and shock the global mountaineering community just a few hours later. Hayden and Inga were experienced skiers who had taken avalanche safety courses. They had studied the route, checked their equipment, and chosen the right day. But the mountains do not forgive even the most prepared. At 6 a.m. then, they set out from the Taylor Fork trailhead, heading for the summit, which was only 20 miles from their home in Bozeman. Ahead of them lay a typical day in the mountains, or so they thought. The first 6 miles to the snow line at 9,000 feet passed without incident. Hayden and Inga moved along the familiar trail through the forest, their breath forming white clouds in the cold autumn air. Reaching the snow line, they switched to skis and began the ascent to the North Couloir. The snow conditions looked stable. Over the past week, about 12 inches of fresh snow had fallen on top of a 47-inch base. The wind had created some drifts, but there were no signs of critical danger. They climbed methodically, stopping to rest and assess the terrain. By noon, they reached an elevation of 10,000 feet, the entrance to the couloir. The couloir was a narrow snow corridor descending from the summit saddle. According to Turiano's description, it was a 1,000-foot descent through a steep, narrow passage that opened into gentle slopes below. For experienced skiers like Hayden and Inga, such a route did not present any particular technical difficulty. They had often skied in similar places during their 2 years in Montana. Hayden examined the snow cover at the entrance to the couloir. The snow seemed cohesive, with no visible signs of instability. Ang checked her backpack, making sure her avalanche beacon was inside and turned off. Standard practice when climbing. They had no idea that this decision would prove fatal. Ahead lay the descent that was supposed to cap off a perfect day in the mountains. The avalanche came down suddenly, like the click of an invisible switch. One moment Hayden and Inga were skiing down a gentle section of the couloir, enjoying the soft snow beneath their skis. The next, the world exploded with movement and roar. A 150-foot wide, 300-foot long slab of snow broke away from the slope with a distinctive crack. Hayden felt the ground beneath him begin to move, turning from solid support into a fluid mass. The flow of snow caught them both and carried them down the couloir at increasing speed. The world turned upside down. Snow filled his eyes, nose, and mouth. Hayden tried to stay on the surface, working his arms as if swimming, but the mass of snow was too great. He felt himself being spun and tossed around in the white chaos. Inga had to be somewhere nearby, but in the roar of the avalanche, he could neither see nor hear her. The flow carried them nearly 1,000 feet down the slope before it began to slow. The snow grew denser, pressing down on his body like concrete. Hayden felt himself being buried, but he kept fighting, trying to break through to the surface. At the last moment, his hand broke through the crust of snow. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The avalanche stopped as abruptly as it had started. An eerie silence reigned in the mountains, broken only by Hayden's heavy breathing. Hayden was buried up to his chest, but his head and one arm remained above the surface. Working frantically with his free arm, he cleared the snow from around his face and began to dig himself out. Every movement was difficult. The snow around him was as hard as cement. Once free, he looked around. Before him lay a chaotic field of debris, an uneven surface of snow blocks and hollows stretching across the entire width of the couloir. Engi was nowhere to be seen. "Engi!" he shouted, but the mountain swallowed his voice. Only an echo came back from the opposite walls of the couloir. Hayden quickly took off his backpack and turned on his avalanche beacon in search mode. The distinctive beeping sound should lead him to Engi's beacon, but the beacon was silent. No signals, no directional cues. Hayden checked the settings, reset the frequency, tried again. Silence. A terrible thought crept into his mind. Enga's beacon was turned off and lying in his backpack. He began shouting her name, moving across the field of debris. "Enga! Enga, answer me!" His cries echoed off the walls of the couloir and faded into the void. She was buried under thousands of tons of snow, and he had no way of knowing where to look. Hayden took out his avalanche probe and began methodically searching the debris field. Every few feet he stuck the probe into the snow, hoping to feel something solid, a body, a backpack, skis. The snow was dense, and the probe was difficult to push in. Most of the time, it hit rocks or chunks of ice. Time was becoming a critical factor. When completely buried in an avalanche, a person has about 15 minutes before oxygen deprivation becomes fatal. Hayden worked feverishly, moving from point to point, probing the snow for any sign of Angie. The minutes dragged on agonizingly. Every movement of the probe could be decisive, every second a last chance. Hayden widened the search area, trying to cover the entire field of debris. His breathing quickened, not only from physical exertion but also from growing panic. Half an hour, an hour. The snow beneath his feet began to harden in the cold, making probing even more difficult. Hayden knew that the math was against him. Even if Engi had been alive in the first few minutes after the avalanche, her chances were now slim to none. But he kept searching. He moved from section to section, poking with the probe, listening. Sometimes he thought he heard something, but it was only the echo of his own breathing and the beating of his heart. The debris field was huge, and he was alone with a handheld probe against thousands of cubic meters of snow. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Hayden stopped in the middle of the field of debris. His strength was failing, his fingers numb with cold. He looked at the endless sea of snowdrifts and hollows, somewhere beneath which lay Anga. The terrible truth finally dawned on him. She was dead. The woman he loved more than anything in the world, who had changed his life and made him dream of a future, was lying somewhere under that snow, and he couldn't save her. The mountains had taken her, as they take everyone who dares to challenge them. And now he had to descend that mountain alone. The descent from Imp Peak turned into the most painful journey of Hayden's life. Every step took him further away from Angie, but he knew he had to reach civilization and bring rescuers. It was his last duty to her. Before leaving, Hayden carefully marked the site of the accident. He stuck a probe in the center of the debris field, left a shovel nearby, and recorded the GPS coordinates. The rescuers had to find her quickly. The descent took several hours. Hayden moved mechanically, oblivious to the beauty of the mountains they both loved so much. The world became flat and gray without the joy they found in every hike. By evening, he reached his car. Angie's scent still lingered in the cabin, and her jacket lay on the back seat. The drive to Bozeman was a blur. His thoughts were there, on the slope where the most important part of his life lay under the snow. But the worst was waiting for him at home. The apartment in Bozeman greeted Hayden with dead silence. Angie's ski gear was standing by the door. The boots she hadn't taken with her today, spare poles, a helmet. Her math textbooks lay on the kitchen table, open to the page with the problems she had been working on last night. Next to it was a half-finished cup of tea. Hayden walked into their bedroom. The bed was unmade. They had rushed out that morning for an early training session. On her nightstand lay a book with a dog-eared page. Angie always dog-eared pages instead of using bookmarks. It used to annoy him. Now he would have given anything to see that dog-eared corner again. He sat down at his desk and took out a sheet of paper. The rescuers needed to know exactly where to look. Hayden began to write a detailed report of what had happened, the time of the avalanche, the size of the debris field, the exact GPS coordinates, a description of the markers he had left. He drew a map of the area, marking landmarks that would help rescuers quickly find the right place. Every line was difficult to write. Writing about the avalanche meant reliving those terrible moments, the crack of the snow slab, the roar of the flow, the dead silence afterward. But Aang deserved to be found. Her family deserved the chance to say goodbye to her. When he finished the note, Hayden carefully folded the sheets and placed them in a prominent place. Tomorrow morning, the rescuers would have all the information they needed. They would find her in a matter of hours instead of days of searching blindly. But Hayden had already made another decision. That night was the longest of Hayden's life. He lay in their bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the avalanche. He analyzed every decision, every move, looking for the moment when everything went wrong. Maybe he should have turned back when he saw the wind gusts. Maybe he should have chosen a different route. Why didn't he insist that Aang turn on the beacon before the descent? A million what-ifs tormented his mind. There is always risk in mountaineering, he knew that. But knowing that didn't ease the pain. Hayden remembered his recent article in Evening Sins. Those we lose leave a hole that nothing can fill. It's like a torn wound that hurts in the cold and burns in the silence. At the time, he was writing about friends who had died in the mountains. He thought he understood that pain. But it turned out he didn't understand anything. Losing a climbing friend was hard. Losing the woman he loved, his life partner, the person with whom he had planned a future, was unbearable. Anga wasn't just a companion in the mountains. She was his anchor, his reason to dream of a life beyond mountaineering. Without her, all their plans, her job as a teacher, his career as a paramedic, their simple happiness in Bozeman, turned to dust. Hayden stood up and walked into the kitchen. Their photos from their last trips hung on the refrigerator, happy faces against mountain backdrops. In one of them, Anga was laughing, her head thrown back. He remembered that moment. She was telling a silly joke about climbers. Now he would never hear her laugh again. Guilt consumed him. He was the more experienced climber, the leader of the pair. It was his job to keep them safe, and he had failed. Anga had trusted him with her life, and he had failed to protect her. The mountains he loved so much, which gave his life meaning, had taken everything he held dear, and soon they would demand final payment. On the morning of October 8th, Hayden sat at his desk, staring at the note for the rescuers. His phone lay nearby. One call to emergency services and the rescue operation would begin immediately. But Hayden couldn't bring himself to pick up the phone. Life without Angie seemed impossible. Every object in the apartment reminded him of her. Every plan for the future included her. How could he teach life-saving when he couldn't save the most important life of all? How could he live in Bozeman, where every trail, every mountain was connected to their memories together? Hayden reread his article in the Evening Sends. But listen to me. They wouldn't want you to break under the weight of their absence. They wouldn't want you to give up. He had written those words about his lost friends, but he couldn't apply them to himself. Anga wasn't just a friend, she was his future. Without her, life had lost its meaning. The mountains no longer beckoned with adventure. They had become a place of tragedy. Being a paramedic no longer felt like a calling. It reminded him of how he had failed to help when it mattered most. Hayden picked up the pen and added the final lines to the note for the rescuers. He apologized to her family. He thanked the rescuers for the work they had to do. He asked them to make sure Angie was buried with the honor she deserved. As he finished the letter, Hayden realized he had made his decision. He couldn't live without Angie. He couldn't wake up every morning knowing she was gone. He couldn't look at the mountains and remember their beauty instead of his inability to protect the woman he loved. Instead of calling the rescue service, he carefully placed the note in a visible place. The rescuers would find it and get all the necessary information. They would find Anga quickly, and her family would be able to say goodbye to her. It was his last gift to the woman he loved more than life itself. On October 8, 2017, the day after the avalanche, Hayden Kennedy decided to end his life. As his parents later said, Hayden survived the avalanche, but he didn't survive the unbearable loss of his life partner. On the morning of October 9th, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office received a call about a missing skier. The dispatcher immediately contacted the Gallatin County Rescue Team. By this time, Hayden's note had already been found, and rescuers had accurate information about the location of the avalanche victim. Doug Chabot, director of the Avalanche Warning Center, studied the coordinates and description provided by Hayden. The accuracy of the information was striking. Every detail had been verified with scientific precision. Markers at the scene, the size of the debris field, the characteristics of the avalanche. Chabot knew that this would save the rescuers precious hours of searching. At 9:15 a.m., the first team of 5 rescuers boarded the helicopter. They were accompanied by 2 specially trained search dogs capable of detecting a person under several feet of snow. An hour later, the helicopter hovered over the peak, and the team was dropped off near the avalanche debris field. The rescuers immediately spotted the markers left by Hayden, a probe and a shovel sticking out of the snow. A second team of 4 was delivered shortly after the first. Working together, they began a systematic search using probes, shovels, and the dogs. The debris field was a chaotic scene. Snow boulders the size of cars were mixed with small debris, creating an uneven surface that stretched 300 feet long and 150 feet wide. The snow had frozen overnight, becoming as hard as concrete. Every movement of the probe required considerable effort. But thanks to Hayden's precise directions, the search did not take long. An hour after the operation began, one of the dogs gave the signal. Rescuers began digging at the indicated spot, working with shovels in their hands. Soon they found Angie Perkins' body under a 3-foot layer of dense snow. But the tragedy was not over yet. Angie was found in the same position in which the avalanche had left her, curled up with her hands pressed against her face in a last-ditch attempt to create an air pocket. The rescuers worked with professional focus, but everyone knew that they were more than a day too late. No one could have survived under that much snow for that long. The news of Hayden's death came while the rescue operation was still ongoing. The young climber's body was found in his apartment in Bozeman, along with a detailed note that helped rescuers find Ang so quickly. The tragedy on the summit of Imp claimed not 1, but 2 lives. Michael and Julie Kennedy released a statement that shook the climbing community. After 27 years of living with the great joy and spirit that was Hayden Kennedy, we share the loss of our son and his partner, Angie Perkins. Hayden survived an avalanche, but did not survive the unbearable loss of his life partner. He chose to end his life. His mother, Julie, and I respect his decision with sadness. News of the tragedy quickly spread across social media and mountaineering forums. Hayden Kennedy was known far beyond the professional community. His climbs on Chero Torre and in Pakistan, His philosophy of pure climbing made him the voice of a new generation of climbers. Losing someone like him at the age of 27 was painful for the entire community. Anga was less known to the general public, but those who knew her spoke of an irreplaceable loss. A math student who dreamed of becoming a teacher, a talented climber who shunned the spotlight, she embodied the best qualities of the mountaineering community: humility, strength, sincerity, and the ability to inspire those around her. Derek Franz, Hayden's friend and author of his obituary in Alpinist magazine, wrote, "Anga was open, strong, and sincere. She reflected the quiet grace that Hayden carried within him. She didn't just climb mountains, she elevated the people around her." Their story could have ended in tragedy, but Hayden left behind something that turned pain into hope for millions of people. Angie's funeral was attended by hundreds of people from different states and countries. Childhood friends from Montana, university classmates, climbing partners, people she had inspired with her example. No one was surprised by the number of mourners. Angie always attracted people with her kindness and sincerity. The climbing community struggled to come to terms with the loss of two bright representatives of a new generation of mountaineers. Hayden and Angie epitomized the evolution of climbing from a pursuit of records to a search for deeper connections with nature and with themselves. Their tragedy raised important questions about the price one pays for a passion for the mountains. But the most important legacy was the philosophy Hayden laid out in his last article. Mountaineering has a dual nature of sublime meaning and utter absurdity. Climbing more difficult, bigger, and steeper routes will not make you a better, more humble, more compassionate, or happier person. But we often approach the mountains as if they can. Hayden saw the mountains as a mirror in which a person reveals their true nature. I have also experienced how mountains expose our true nature. We see who we are, we see who our partners really are, and they see us in return. For him, mountaineering was not a sport or a way to prove something to the world, but a path to self-discovery and genuine closeness with other people. The most poignant words in his article were about the loss of loved ones. "Those we lose leave a hole that nothing can fill. It's like an open wound that hurts in the cold and burns in the silence. You carry it with you, and sometimes it feels heavier than you can bear. But listen to me, they wouldn't want you to break under the weight of their absence. They wouldn't want you to give up." These words, written 2 weeks before the tragedy, became both a prophecy and a legacy. Hayden was unable to follow his own advice, but his call for resilience in the face of loss remains. Thousands of people who have experienced the loss of loved ones in the mountains and in life find support and inspiration in them. The story of Hayden Kennedy and Angie Perkins is not just a tale of an avalanche tragedy. It is a reminder of the fragility of human life, the power of love, and the importance of cherishing those around us. The mountains gave them meaning, brought them together, and ultimately took them apart. But the love they shared, their philosophy of unity with nature, and their pursuit of authenticity continue to inspire people around the world. As Outside Online wrote in its obituary, Hayden was a thinker, a seeker, and a storyteller of truths too raw for polished tales of triumph. Their story teaches us that the true value of life lies not in achievements and records, but in deep connections with people and honesty with ourselves, even in the face of the greatest loss. Hayden and Angie's story makes us think about the most painful questions of human existence. Was Hayden selfish for abandoning his parents and friends for his own pain? Or was his action a manifestation of true love when life without a loved one loses all meaning? Can you judge someone for not being able to cope with loss? Or should society be more understanding that some wounds never heal? Is it worth doing extreme sports when you know how much pain your death could cause your loved ones? Or is the right to take risks the foundation of human freedom? Write in the comments what you think about this story and what you would do if you were in Hayden's place. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps our channel grow both in numbers and quality. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episodes. In May 2006, an incredible drama of survival unfolded on Everest. The mountain, which serves as an icy graveyard for more than 200 climbers, was preparing to claim another life. 50-year-old veteran Lincoln Hall returned to finish what he started 22 years ago. He would find himself in a deadly trap at an altitude of 2,800 feet in the death zone, where every minute without oxygen irrevocably kills brain cells. When his own team exhausted all hope of rescue, Lincoln's story should have ended. But what happens the next morning will challenge everything we know about the limits of human capability, and the rescue operation will forever go down in history as an example of the most extraordinary heroism and the most agonizing moral choice at the top of the world. At the center of this storm was a man who was more than just a climber. Lincoln Hall was 50 years old. In his everyday life, he was a writer, philanthropist, and practicing Buddhist. His connection to the Himalayas was not just athletic, it was spiritual. He was one of the founders of the Australian Himalayan Foundation, dedicating years of his life to improving education and healthcare in remote Nepalese villages. He was the father of 2 sons, Dylan and Dorje. The name of his younger son, Dorje, was a tribute to the Sherpa people, whom he deeply respected. But behind the image of this calm intellectual lay an obsession. In 1984, as part of the first Australian expedition, Hall pioneered a new, daring route up the North Face. They called it the White Limbo Route, a vertical ice chute known as the Great Couloir. It was pure mountaineering without oxygen, at the limit of human capability. He was only getting 500 feet from the summit when his body began to fail. He recognized the symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, an enemy that kills climbers from within, and made the wise but agonizing decision to turn back. He later described this failure in his book, White Limbo. It was a setback that became a dark shadow that, in his own words, poisoned his soul. He lived with this ghost for 22 years. The decision to return came when he was 50. It was a difficult conversation with his wife, Barbara, and teenage sons. He explained it as his last chance to close the gestalt that had haunted him for half his life. The family had mixed feelings about it. They supported him, understanding this passion as part of his personality, but Barbara did not hide her concern about the risks, his age and the children waiting at home. Despite the stakes, preparations for the expedition were rushed, according to his friends. He spent only a few weeks training, mainly running and doing general physical conditioning. The years had softened his body. This time, Lincoln consciously relied not on his youthful endurance, which was a thing of the past, but on his wealth of experience. He replaced physical strength with mental fortitude and his Buddhist deep breathing practices. He was confident that it was his mind, not his body, that would carry him to the summit. With this confidence, Lincoln arrived in Tibet. The 2006 expedition had nothing in common with the risky 1984 expedition. This time, he put his trust in the powerful Seven Summits Club. Its leader, Alexander Abramov, was renowned for organizing some of the most ambitious and well-equipped expeditions on the mountain. It was a first-class commercial operation that guaranteed safety. The best Sherpas surrounded Lincoln, had unlimited oxygen supplies, and all the logistics were worked out down to the smallest detail. What's more, his close friend Mike Dillon was waiting for him at base camp. Dillon was a professional documentary filmmaker and had come to make a film about his friend's return to the summit. This whole system, designed for success, seemed unbreakable. But on 22nd May, 3 days before Lincoln's planned assault, the illusion of safety collapsed. Thomas Weber, a German climber from their own team, collapsed at an altitude of 2,700 feet. High-altitude edema killed him within hours. The mountain reminded them that no amount of logistics could guarantee survival in the death zone. At 2 a.m. on 25th May 2006, a group of climbers stepped out of their tents at Camp 4 at an altitude of 2,200 feet into the icy darkness. The temperature had dropped to 22 degrees. The wind at this altitude did not just blow. It roared like a jet engine, drowning out all thought. The only sound in the thin air was the mechanical hiss of oxygen regulators and the dry, desperate crunch of crampons on frozen snow. In this chain of dim headlamps slowly creeping upward was Lincoln Hall. He was in the tunnel of his 22-year obsession. Adrenaline and the flow of pure oxygen completely overwhelmed fatigue, age, and fear. But the atmosphere in the Seven Summits Club team was oppressive. The Sherpas, including Lincoln's personal guide Dorje, were gloomy and taciturn. They exchanged short phrases in their language, avoiding looking up at the slope. The reason was simple and terrifying. 3 days earlier, on 22nd of May, their teammate Thomas Weber had begun his attempt to climb from the same Camp 4. At an altitude of 27,500 feet, the German climber suddenly collapsed. High-altitude cerebral edema killed him in a matter of hours. His body remained lying on the slope, on the very route that Lincoln's team was now following. Before leaving, Dorje burned a bundle of juniper branches at the tent's entrance and recited a Buddhist prayer, a protective ritual performed by Sherpas before perilous climbs. The smoke spread across the ice, carrying the prayers to the spirits of the mountain. It was not just a ritual. It was an acknowledgement that the hill had already taken one life and might claim another. Lincoln had seen this ritual before, but he did not understand its true meaning. He was utterly focused on the summit, on his 22-year obsession. Perhaps he did not know all the details of Weber's death. Maybe he deliberately did not allow himself to think about it. The team had already lost one person. This thought hung heavily in the air, but Lincoln, step by step, was moving toward his triumph. After 7 hours of grueling ascent, at 9 a.m., Lincoln Hall reached the summit of Everest. At that altitude, 29,000 feet, the curvature of the earth was visible to the naked eye, and the sky above was dark purple. He felt himself filled with an energy he thought he had long lost. He had done it. The weight of decades that had been pressing on his shoulders was finally lifted. He unfurled the Australian flag. The Sherpas took several photographs. He took out his satellite phone and dialed Mike Dillon's number at base camp. His voice was calm and steady. He reported that he was at the summit. Mike congratulated him, but the warmth in his voice was mixed with concern. He could hear not only joy in Lincoln's voice, but also profound, extreme fatigue. He reminded Lincoln of an old mountaineering adage, "Remember, buddy, you're only halfway there." For Lincoln, this was the peak of his life, but the most dangerous hours lay ahead. The disaster began almost as soon as Lincoln turned downward. The oxygen deprivation that his brain had ignored on the way up hit him with the force of a hammer. Sherpa Dorje, who was walking behind him, was the first to notice something was wrong. Lincoln's gaze became glazed. His steps became unsteady and heavy, like a man walking through deep sand. It was the first sign of high-altitude cerebral edema. The enemy from which Lincoln had wisely fled in 1984 had now caught up with him. And this time, it did not retreat. Lincoln's consciousness began to disintegrate. He felt his lungs burning and his muscles going numb. He muttered incoherent words. He thought he saw village lights or was floating in a boat on the sea. He began to resist help actively. At one point, he ripped off his oxygen mask, shouting that he didn't need it and that it was suffocating him. The Sherpas tried in horror to put it back on, but Lincoln pushed them away. He tried to walk away from the trail, toward his lights, and Dorje had to drag him away from the edge of the precipice physically. This was the beginning of 9 hours of agony. 3 Sherpas, Dorje, Lakcha, and Dawa Tenzing, found themselves trapped at an altitude of 28,500 feet with a dying man who weighed 176 pounds and was actively fighting against his own rescue. The second step awaited them. It is a 130-foot, almost vertical rock wall. Climbing it is difficult. Lowering an incapacitated, resisting body is virtually impossible. It took them 4 hours to drag Lincoln through this section. 4 hours of desperate struggle at the limit of their strength, in the most hostile place on the planet. They secured ropes, tied him up, and tried to lower him like cargo. But Lincoln, delirious, clung to the rocks, his body thrashing against the stones. The Sherpa's hands burned from the friction of the ropes, their own oxygen melting away with every passing minute. The wind was picking up. In the midst of this struggle, another disaster struck. Laksha suddenly groaned and began rubbing his eyes. Earlier that morning, during the ascent to the summit, the glass of his protective goggles had cracked from being hit by an ice axe. He taped the crack with electrical tape and continued climbing. He couldn't stop. But through the crack in his goggles, his left eye had been exposed to direct ultraviolet radiation for 7 hours, which, at an altitude of 26,300 feet, is 5 times as intense as on the ground. At first, there was a slight burning sensation which he ignored. Now, 9 hours into the climb, the pain was unbearable. Snow blindness, ultraviolet corneal burns, had set in with full force. Lakshi's eyelids were swollen, and tears streamed from his eyes, instantly freezing on his eyelashes. The vision in his left eye had turned into a red, cloudy blur. He could still see something with his right eye, but every attempt to open his eyes felt like broken glass under his eyelids. "I can hardly see anything," he croaked to Dorji. Now they had 2 incapacitated climbers. Desperate, fragmented reports from the Sherpas came over the radio to base camp. Expedition leader Alexander Abramov listened to them. He was in an unbearable position. He had already lost one client, Thomas Weber. Now, on the same slope, a second was dying, and along with him, 3 Sherpas were at risk of dying. It was not a single radio session, but a series of agonizing negotiations that lasted for hours. Listening to this at ABC, Abramov realized that the situation was out of control. By 7 p.m., after 9 hours of continuous struggle, the situation had become critical. The Sherpas had run out of oxygen. The 7 Summits Club team did have large reserves, but they were in Camp 4, where the Sherpas had started their ascent. They had taken cylinders based on a standard schedule, 7 hours of ascent and 4 hours of descent. The supply was for 15 hours, but the 9-hour struggle with Lincoln broke all calculations. Moreover, they periodically connected the mask to Hall, trying to bring him back to consciousness, consuming precious oxygen twice as fast. By 7 in the evening, their tanks were empty, and they were still at an altitude of 28,200 feet. Laksha was blinded. Lincoln Hall was no longer moving. He lay unconscious in the snow, his breathing barely discernible. Abramov's decision was ruthless, pragmatic, and, in the logic of the death zone, the only correct one. He gave the order over the radio: "Leave him. Save your lives. Descend immediately." For the Sherpas, it was a death sentence. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and depressed. They had done everything they could. Silence reigned, broken only by the howling wind. They conducted the final test. Dorji knelt and took off his thick glove, risking frostbite on his own fingers. He tried to feel for a pulse on Lincoln's neck under the layers of his down suit. Nothing. He waited, counting silently. 30 seconds, a minute. Nothing. Laksha, squinting with one eye, tried to feel for a pulse on his wrist. Nothing either. Dorji leaned closer, trying to hear his breathing, but at 28,500 feet with the wind and his own oxygen mask, it was useless. He shone his flashlight into Lincoln's eyes. His pupils were dilated and unmoving. He pressed on the eyeball, the pain reflex, the last sign of life. No reaction. The body did not move. Dorji knew that in extreme cold, a person could enter a state similar to suspended animation, when the pulse is almost imperceptible. He had seen this once before, and the climber had been saved. But then they had oxygen, daylight, and 2 hours to reach camp. Now it was night. They had run out of oxygen. Laksha was blind, and it would take several hours to climb down in the dark to reach camp. Even if Lincoln were still alive, they would not be able to get him down. All 4 of them would die. Dorji Sherpa, after whom Lincoln named his youngest son, leaned over the body and whispered the quiet Buddhist prayer, Om Mani Padme Hum. It was the most tragic moment of his career. They carefully removed Lincoln's backpack and camera. In Sherpa culture, there is a tradition of delivering the last personal belongings of the deceased to their family if the body remains on the mountain. Then they turned around, hoisting the exhausted, blinded Lakchu onto their backs, and began the slow descent into darkness, leaving Lincoln Hall to die. At base camp, Mike Dillon heard the whole nightmare on the radio. He turned off the radio and picked up his satellite phone. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening. Calls like this, at this time of night, never bring good news. He made the most challenging call of his life. On the other end of the line, in Australia, Barbara Hall picked up the phone. Mike told her the terrible news. Lincoln Hall was officially dead. At base camp, Mike Dillon dropped the satellite phone. The icy tent turned into a vacuum, where the only sound was the howling wind outside. His best friend, whom Dillon had known for 20 years, with whom he had gone on the 1984 expedition, had just died before his eyes, live on the radio. He buried him by telling his wife the terrible news. The shock slowly gave way to an icy, heavy emptiness. On the other side of the world, in Australia, Barbara Hall hung up the phone. The world narrowed to the silence of the house at night. She went into the room of her sons, Dylan and Dorja. She had to tell them that their father would not be coming home. The older son began to cry. Barbara felt not just grief, but a cold emptiness. The man who had been the center of her life had disappeared on an icy slope thousands of miles from home. Exhausted by grief, she eventually fell into a heavy, restless sleep. And that very night she had a dream. It was incredibly vivid and real. She saw Lincoln walking toward her. He was alone, he looked tired, but he was walking and smiling broadly and brightly. At that very moment, at an altitude of 8,500 feet, in absolute darkness and silence, Lincoln Hall's body came to life. He opened his eyes. Consciousness returned in complete bewilderment. The body lay on the snow, in absolute solitude. The first thought was, where are the Sherpas? But then his brain, still in the grip of edema, pieced together the picture. He remembered falling, struggling. He looked at his belt. His backpack was gone. His oxygen tank was gone. His ice axe was gone. He realized with chilling clarity, they had left him to die. That thought should have killed him. But instead of panic, he felt a strange, detached calm that came from years of Buddhist meditation practice. He was still alive. Night fell. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees. Sleep meant death. That was the only thing his brain understood clearly. To keep himself from fading away, Lincoln began a 12-hour battle for his life. He started body pumping, rocking back and forth to generate even a drop of heat. He rubbed his frostbitten face with snow, trying to chase away sleep. His brain was his worst enemy. Hallucinations caused by hypoxia returned with a vengeance. He thought the mountain was the deck of a ship rocking on the waves, and he muttered that, "The weather is perfect for a cruise." Then he was overcome by paradoxical warmth, a sure sign of deep hypothermia. He thought he was covered with a warm blanket and began to unzip his down suit, releasing the last of his warmth. It took incredible willpower to recognize this lie and zip himself back up. He clung to images of his family, repeating his sons' names like a mantra. That's how he spent the whole night, alone, on the roof of the world. At 7:30 a.m. on 26th May, with the first rays of the sun, another team approached him. It was Dan Mazur, an experienced guide, and 3 of his clients, Andrew Brace, Miles Osborne, and Jangbu Sherpa. They were heading for the summit. They knew that somewhere here, on the ridge, lay the corpse of an Australian who had died the day before. It was a grim but common sight on Everest. Suddenly, the body moved. They stopped dead in their tracks. The scene was surreal. At an altitude of 2,800 feet, in the icy wind, sat a man. He had no helmet and no gloves. His down suit was unzipped to the waist. He was changing something in his shirt, as if he were going for a walk. As they got closer, he looked up at them and then at his frostbitten hands. He held his blackened fingers in the air as if they were wax candles. Lincoln Hall looked at the stunned climbers and croaked the phrase that went down in history. "I suppose you're surprised to see me here." Dan Mazur and his team were in shock. Before them was a living zombie, but the shock quickly gave way to the realization of their situation. They were 2 hours from the summit of Everest. It was their life's goal. Years of training, tens of thousands of dollars, all for these last few feet. They were at the same moral crossroads that had killed British climber David Sharp a week earlier. Sharp was dying in the Green Cave, and more than 40 climbers passed him on their way to the summit. They saw him, but pretended not to notice. In the death zone, every gram of oxygen and every minute counts. Stopping to help someone else means almost inevitable failure to reach the summit and a considerable risk to your own life. Dan Mazur looked at Lincoln, muttering about cruising. He looked at his clients, waiting for his decision. The decision was made instantly. There were no lengthy discussions. Mazur and his team silently agreed that they couldn't leave him behind. The rescue began immediately. They made Lincoln put on their own spare gloves, gave him hot tea from their thermoses, and fed him chocolate. Most importantly, they took off their own oxygen tanks and connected Lincoln to a fresh supply. Then Mazur picked up the radio. He tuned into the Seven Summits Club frequency and called Alexander Abramov's camp. What he said threw ABC into chaos. "Alexander, this is Dan Mazur. I'm at the second step. Your climber, Lincoln Hall. He's alive." Silence reigned on the other end. Abramov was sure it was a hallucination or a mistake. "Dan, that's impossible," came the reply. "We have confirmation. He's dead. You must be mistaken." Mazur had to convince them, shouting into the radio that it was not a mistake. "I'm looking at him right now. He's talking to me. He needs oxygen. He needs to be evacuated." He was arguing for the life of a man he had met 5 minutes ago, wasting precious time and his own dwindling oxygen supply. They kept Lincoln on the brink of life for 4 hours. Their own oxygen was almost gone. They did everything they could, but they couldn't bring themselves to let him go. Now everything depended on the people who had left him to die the day before. Dan Mazur's radio message threw the Seven Summits Club camp into chaos. The news that Lincoln Hall was alive was not just a shock, it was a logistical nightmare. Alexander Abramov, who had just buried 2 clients in 24 hours, now had to organize the highest rescue in his company's history. He immediately mobilized everyone who could stand. 12 Sherpas in ABC and North Col camps were ordered to drop everything and prepare to leave. It was a rescue operation unlike any other in the company's history. The rescue team was led by Sirdar, Chief Sherpa, Ming Magela. Dorji Sherpa was also part of the team, the same Dorji who just a few hours earlier had read prayers over Lincoln's dead body. For him, this expedition was not just a job, it was a personal duty. Armed with fresh oxygen tanks, medicine, tea, and ropes, the team of Sherpas began a desperate climb from 21,000 feet back into the death zone. It took them 4 hours to reach Mazur's group at 28,200 feet. A quick, silent handover of the patient took place. Dan Mazur's team, having given all their resources and sacrificed the summit, was on the verge of exhaustion. They handed Lincoln over to the fresh team and immediately began their own descent to safety. For Lincoln Hall and 12 Sherpas, a 10-hour descent into hell began. He was no longer in the same condition Mazur had found him. The oxygen had restored some of his consciousness, but with it came hallucinations. He kept pulling off his mask, trying to get back to his ship. The Sherpas dragged, carried, and pulled him down. Every few steps the Australian fell. The Sherpas lifted him, shouted, and forced him to move. It was not a gentle rescue. It was a brutal struggle for life. where the rescuers themselves were at their limit. At one point, when Hall once again collapsed limply into the snow and refused to get up, one of the Sherpas, in desperation, swung his ice axe at him. It was not a threat. It was a primal cry. "Go, or you will die here, and we will die with you." The descent was painfully slow and took place in 3 stages. It was not a single push. The first stage was the descent from 28,200 feet to the North Col, and then to Camp 4 at 23,000 feet. The expedition doctor, Andrei Selivanov, had already climbed there, risking his own life. The second stage was the night at North Col. The team reached the camp late at night on 26 May. Lincoln was in critical condition. Dr. Selivanov fought for his life all night in an icy tent, administering medication for brain edema and keeping him warm. The third stage began on the morning of 27 May. After the doctor stabilized the Australian's condition, the Sherpas started the final, longest descent from North Col to advanced base camp at 21,000 feet. Mike Dillon was waiting for him at ABC. When Dillon saw the figure he had buried a day and a half earlier, he rushed to him. It was a reunion that seemed impossible. Later, when Lincoln had recovered a little, he looked at his friend and uttered a phrase that has become legendary. He said, "Thank you for that call. Now please call her back." The price for this miracle was high. The first prize was physical. Lincoln Hall was evacuated to Kathmandu and then to Australia. His hands and feet were blackened from severe frostbite. Surgeons were forced to amputate 6 fingertips on his hands and his right big toe. When he was finally able to speak to his wife from the hospital, he told her the price of his survival. Barbara's response was immediate. "I will love you even if you lose all your fingers." The second was moral retribution. The 2006 season went down in Everest history as one of the deadliest and most shameful. While Dan Mazur and his team sacrificed their summit attempt to save Hall, just a week earlier, more than 40 climbers had passed by the dying British climber David Sharp, rushing toward their goal. Lincoln's miraculous rescue was a stark rebuke and answer to the mountain's ultimate ethical question: which is more important, the summit or the man? And finally, there was the final reckoning. Not instantaneous, but stretched out over years. Lincoln Hall did not blame Abramov's team. He understood the ruthless rules of the death zone and was eternally grateful for his rescue. He returned home a hero, a living miracle. His story spread around the world. But that night at 28,500 feet left invisible scars. The amputated fingers were only the external cost. Brain swelling, 12 hours in the death zone, severe hypothermia. All of this depleted his body at the cellular level. Doctors warned that every hour in extreme hypoxia takes months of recovery for the body. That night took years. 6 years later, in 2012, at the age of 56, Lincoln Hall died of mesothelioma. It was an aggressive form of cancer caused by asbestos dust he had inhaled as a child. The disease had a latency period of 30 to 40 years and would have caught up with him anyway. But doctors told Barbara what she had long feared to hear. The extreme exhaustion of his body on Everest had weakened his immune system. The cancer progressed more rapidly and aggressively. Lincoln lived 8 to 10 years less than he could have. The mountain didn't kill him that night, but it took so much of his strength that when the real enemy came, the demon from his distant childhood lurking in his lungs, Lincoln had no resources left to fight. He conquered Everest, but he paid for that victory with years of his life. A Texas pathologist knew better than anyone what death looked like. Every day he studied the bodies of those who would never return. In May 1996, he was about to experience his own death. Twice. At an altitude of 2,600 feet, in an area where the human body is physiologically incapable of surviving for more than a few hours. A drama unfolded that no medical textbook could have predicted. At an altitude of 30,000 feet above sea level, rises Everest, the colossus of the Himalayas, where atmospheric pressure is only 30% of normal. In the death zone above 26,000 feet, oxygen becomes critically unavailable to tissues, and the body loses it faster than it can replenish it. Without supplemental oxygen, a person loses consciousness in 2 to 3 minutes and dies within 15 minutes. Even with oxygen tanks, climbers cannot stay here for more than 48 hours. The physical conditions are compounded by the harsh climate. Temperatures regularly drop to 40 degrees Celsius, and winds reach 70 miles per hour. At such temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. In this unforgiving world, any mistake can be fatal. May 1996 will forever remain in Everest's history as a time of disaster that claimed 8 lives. Among the 17 climbers trapped in a storm above 26,000 feet, Beck Weathers' story became a symbol of how the human spirit can defy the laws of physiology and inevitable death. What happened on the slopes of Everest in those May days is the story of a man twice left for dead who somehow found his way back to life. Beck Weathers did not fit the stereotype of a climber. At 49, this Dallas pathologist, with his engaging smile and calm demeanor, seemed more like a successful middle-class doctor than a conqueror of the highest peaks. However, appearances can be deceiving. Inside, Weathers lived a demon he called the Black Dog, chronic depression that had tormented him for more than 2 decades. Weathers discovered mountaineering at the ripe old age of 40 during a trip to the Rocky Mountains. This activity became more than just a hobby for him. It was a way to combat his depression. At high altitudes, where every decision could be a matter of life and death, his mind became clear and his soul found peace. With his characteristic stubbornness and determination, Beck progressed quickly, conquering Denali, Aconcagua, and Kilimanjaro. He set himself an ambitious goal: the 7 summits, the highest mountains on each continent, and Everest was the key link in this chain. But climbing came at a price. With each new expedition, his relationship with his wife Peach and his children, Beck Jr. and Meg, became increasingly strained. By 1996, the situation had reached a critical point. His wife Peach gave him an ultimatum. If he went to Everest, she would file for divorce. Beck chose the mountain, as if pushing himself over the edge. For the expedition, Weathers chose Adventure Consultants, a company run by New Zealander Rob Hall, known for his professionalism and impeccable reputation. Hall, who had conquered the 7 summits in 7 months, was one of the pioneers of commercial mountaineering on Everest. His main rival was American Scott Fisher, who headed Mountain Madness, a company with a more relaxed approach to organization. These 2 groups, friends and rivals, would become central figures in the unfolding drama. By the 1990s, Everest had transformed from an arena for elite climbers into a lucrative business. While fewer than 300 people had conquered the summit before the 1980s, nearly 900 did so in the 1990s alone. For $60,000, $70,000, virtually anyone with sufficient means could buy a ticket to the roof of the world, even without serious experience in high-altitude mountaineering. This commercialization changed the very nature of climbing. The number of expeditions grew, and with it, the risks. On May 10, 1996, several groups crowded into the narrow corridor leading to the summit of Everest: Adventure Consultants, Mountain Madness, and a Taiwanese expedition. A critical factor was the delay in installing fixed ropes on the Hillary Step, the last technical obstacle before the summit. The Taiwanese Sherpas failed to do their part, creating a bottleneck at an altitude of about 2,800 feet. Climbers, including Hall and Fisher's clients, were forced to wait for over an hour at an extremely dangerous altitude, where every minute takes away precious oxygen. For Beck Weathers, the situation was complicated by an additional factor. Before the expedition, he underwent radial keratotomy, an operation to correct myopia. In the thin high-altitude air, his cornea deformed, causing serious vision problems. Already during the ascent from base camp to Camp 1, Weathers noticed that his vision was deteriorating with altitude. By the time he reached Camp 3 at an altitude of 24,000 feet, he was experiencing serious difficulties, and accidental contact with an ice crystal damaged his eye, further exacerbating the situation. The acclimatization process in April 1996 went relatively smoothly. Beck and the other climbers made gradual ascents to higher and higher altitudes, allowing their bodies to adapt to the thin air. On the morning of May 10, 1996, Rob Hall made a decision that would forever change the fate of Beck Weathers. At an altitude of 26,000 feet on South Col, the last camp before the summit push, Hall assessed Weathers' condition and his near-total blindness. The route ahead included the Hillary Step, a narrow rock section where the slightest mistake meant a fall of thousands of feet. The decision was obvious. Beck could not continue the climb. "If I descend from the summit and you're not here," Hall said to Weathers, "I won't know if you made it safely back to camp or if you fell to your death. Promise me you'll stay here until I return." Weathers agreed, unaware that this decision would put him in mortal danger, but ultimately save his life. Beck settled on the South Col, hoping that Hall would return for him in a few hours. At the same time, another group, an IMAX documentary crew led by experienced climber David Breciers, was also preparing for the ascent. However, unlike Hall and Fisher's teams, they noticed signs of an approaching storm, increasing winds and clouds gathering over the mountain. Opting for safety, the IMAX team abandoned the climb and returned to base camp, a decision that saved their lives. In contrast to the caution of the IMAX team, the commercial expeditions continued their journey to the summit. Both Hall and Fisher, despite their experience, succumbed to summit fever, a phenomenon where the desire to reach the goal overshadows common sense. Hall, known for his discipline, set a deadline for returning, 2 p.m., regardless of whether the summit was reached or not. But when that moment came, both Hall and his client Doug Hansen were still climbing. Breaking his own rules set off a chain of events that would soon turn the mountain into a scene of tragedy. The phenomenon of summit fever is known in mountaineering as a psychological state in which the desire to achieve a goal overshadows rational risk assessment. On May 10, 1996, this phenomenon manifested itself in its most dramatic form. Doug Hansen, a 46-year-old postman from Washington, became a classic example of this condition. A year earlier, he had been forced to turn back just 300 feet from the summit. Now, having paid $65,000 and trained for a year, he was obsessed with finishing what he had started, despite being clearly exhausted. Hall, rather than insisting on a return, gave in to his client, breaking his own rule about when to turn back. Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese businesswoman, exhibited similar behavior. Determined to become the second Japanese woman to conquer the 7 summits, she ignored signs of physical exhaustion. Weighing about 40 kilo, Namba moved slower and slower, but categorically refused offers to turn back. "She looked like a zombie," recalled one eyewitness, "but she kept going." Namba reached the summit around 3 p.m., when the weather had already begun to deteriorate. Sandy Pittman, a socialite and client of Mountain Madness, slowed the group down by carrying heavy equipment for an internet broadcast. Her decision to continue the climb despite her physical unpreparedness reflected the general mood: to reach the summit at any cost. By 3 p.m. on May 10th, the weather had deteriorated dramatically. The clear morning gave way to an approaching storm, with winds reaching 50-70 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility was reduced to almost zero due to heavy snow. The climbers, still on or descending from the summit, suddenly found themselves in a life-threatening situation. Neil Beidelman, a Mountain Madness guide, later described the conditions as being inside a milk bottle, an absolute whiteout where you couldn't even see your own feet. The group, which included Beck Weathers, who had been waiting for many hours on the South Col, and Yasuko Namba, who was descending, was trapped. They were only 1,000 feet from Camp 4 but completely disoriented in the snowstorm. Weathers, almost completely blind, relied on others. Namba, exhausted from the climb, could barely stand. Guides Mike Groom and Neil Beitelman tried to lead the group, but conditions became increasingly unbearable. At a critical moment, Neil Beitelman made a decision that saved the lives of some climbers, but set off a chain of events that proved fatal for others in the expedition. The group stopped, unaware that they were only 80 feet from the edge of the Kangshung face, a 7,000-foot vertical drop. A few more steps and they could all have fallen into the abyss. The decision to stop had critical physiological consequences. In extreme cold, movement is key to survival. Without constant physical activity, the body's internal temperature drops rapidly, leading to hypothermia. The group lay in the snow, gradually drifting off to sleep, which for many could have been eternal. The climbers tried to support each other, shouting and pushing their comrades who were falling asleep, but the storm made communication almost impossible. At this time, at an altitude of about 28,700 feet, on a narrow rocky ridge known as the Hillary Step, another tragedy was unfolding. Rob Hall and his client Doug Hansen were stuck during their descent. Hansen, completely exhausted after reaching the summit, lost the ability to move on his own. Hall, true to his principle of never leaving a client behind, stayed with him, despite the intensifying storm. Hall contacted base camp via radio and explained the situation. Guy Cotter, a fellow guide, begged Hall to leave Hansen and save himself, but he refused. Shortly thereafter, communication was lost. When it was restored, Hall reported only that Doug is gone. What exactly happened to Hansen, whether he died of hypothermia or fell off the cliff, remains unknown. Hansen's body has not been found to this day. After Hansen's disappearance, Hall was left alone at an altitude of nearly 6 miles, in the epicenter of the storm. Due to the severe weather conditions, a rescue operation was impossible. In one of the most touching moments of this tragedy, Rob was connected by satellite phone to his pregnant wife Jan in New Zealand. In his last conversation, he told her, "Sleep well, my darling. Please don't worry too much." Hall was the last of the climbers to die, having survived 2 nights on the South Ridge and part of the 3rd day. On another part of the mountain, Scott Fisher, founder of Mountain Madness, also found himself in a deadly trap. Weakened by illness and dehydration, he was unable to descend below 27,000 feet. Fisher, one of the strongest climbers of his generation, who had conquered K2 and Everest without oxygen, was found sitting in the snow, frozen, with his eyes open, staring toward the summit. In the midst of the storm, a heroic episode unfolded. Anatoly Bukreev, a Russian high-altitude guide from the Mountain Madness team, made 3 separate sorties from Camp 4 in an attempt to rescue the lost climbers. "I did everything I could, but the storm was stronger than us. Finding anyone in that darkness was almost impossible," he later recalled. Acting without oxygen support, relying only on his high-altitude acclimatization and experience, Bukreev managed to rescue several climbers, including Sandy Pittman and Charlotte Fox. However, he was unable to find Beck Weathers and Yasuko Namba. By this time, Weathers and Namba were in extremely serious condition. Hypothermia was progressing, causing a paradoxical reaction, a feeling of heat and a desire to remove clothing, even though the body was actually freezing. The night of May 10th to 11 was a test of human endurance. Beck and Yasuko lay in the snow, gradually sinking into hypothermic coma while the storm buried their bodies. The body, fighting for survival, constricts the blood vessels in the extremities in an effort to conserve heat for vital organs. This is a protective mechanism, but it leads to frostbite in the hands and feet, which are deprived of blood supply. On the morning of May 11th, Stuart Hutchison, a cardiologist with Adventure Consultants, accompanied by 3 Sherpas, set out to search for the missing climbers. They found Weathers and Namba lying next to each other, covered in snow. Hutchison cleared 3 inches of ice from their faces. Both showed signs of life. dilated pupils, barely perceptible breathing, but their skin was porcelain-like, a clear sign of severe frostbite. Based on his medical experience and understanding of high-altitude physiology, Hutchison made a painful decision. Beck and Yasuko were too close to death. Their rescue was beyond the realm of possibility. In high-altitude conditions, transporting an unconscious person is virtually impossible and puts rescuers at mortal risk. Hutchison and the Sherpas returned to camp with the grim news. The news of Beckweather's death was relayed down the chain of command, first to base camp, then to the Adventure Consultant's office in Christchurch, and finally to Dallas, where a phone call on a warm, sunny Saturday morning shattered the life of Peach Weathers. Beck was declared dead during the descent from the South Ridge. No one could have imagined that Beckweather's story would not end there. At the moment when the whole world believed him dead, his heart was still beating inside his frozen body, and his mind was fighting the darkness, preparing to make one of the most incredible comebacks in the history of mountaineering. At around 4 p.m. on May 11, 1996, nearly 15 hours after Beckweathers fell into a hypothermic coma at a temperature of about 22 degrees, something happened that, from a medical point of view, borders on the impossible. His eyes opened. At first, his consciousness was clouded. Beck thought he was in his bedroom in Dallas, with the Texas sun shining through the window. But gradually, reality emerged through the veil of hypoxia. He was lying on the frozen slope of Everest, covered in snow. Weathers saw his right hand in front of him, gray, lifeless, resembling a piece of wood. In an attempt to clarify his condition, he hit the ice with his hand, and it made a sound like a wooden block knocking. That moment became a point of focus. Beck realized where he was and what had happened to him. I realized that I wasn't in my bed, but somewhere on a mountain, alone, and I didn't know where, he later recalled. One of the mysteries of this story remains why Weather was alone when he regained consciousness, even though he had been left next to Yasuko Namba. He later suggested that he may have regained consciousness between morning and afternoon, traveling about 50 yards toward high camp before losing consciousness again. There were no witnesses to confirm these movements. But what caused this amazing awakening? I opened my eyes and saw a crystal-clear vision of my wife and children. It made me get up and keep moving, Weather said. Neurophysiologists suggest that a powerful emotional stimulus may have triggered the release of adrenaline and other stress hormones, temporarily overcoming the effects of hypothermia and hypoxia. Weather's condition was critical. His hands were completely frostbitten. His face was ravaged by the cold. He hadn't eaten for 3 days and hadn't drunk water for 2 days. In a state of severe hypothermia and hypoxia, with minimal visibility, he made the only decision he could, to walk. Driven by the vision of his family and a basic instinct for survival, Weather began to move. Every step was painful. His legs, frostbitten and like porcelain, struggled to maintain balance. His right arm was immobile in an unnatural position, and his left arm was partially functional. In this condition, he began his descent from an altitude of 26,000 feet, guided by faint landmarks and instinct. I couldn't see the route, Weathers recalled, but I felt I had to keep going. I believed my family was waiting for me. This journey, in a semi-conscious state, at the limits of physical endurance, became one of the most incredible displays of the human will to live ever recorded in extreme conditions. At around 6 p.m., as the sun was setting, Beck Weathers appeared at the door of the tent in high camp at an altitude of 26,000 feet. The shock of the climbers who saw him was unimaginable. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, recalled climber Todd Burleson. This man had no face. It was completely black, like a hard crust. His jacket was unbuttoned to the waist and full of snow. His right arm was bare and frozen above his head. His skin looked like marble, white stone, without circulation. "You won't believe who just arrived at camp," was the message relayed by radio to base camp. The response was realistic, but hopeless. "That's interesting, but it doesn't change anything. He's going to die. Don't bring him down." This information was not relayed to Beck. The medical reality was grim. With such frostbite and in such a condition, the chances of survival were close to zero, especially considering the upcoming descent through dangerous areas that required the use of hands. Burleson quickly gathered his thoughts and took Weathers to the tent of the late Scott Fisher, where he was wrapped in 2 sleeping bags, warmed with hot bottles, and given steroids to combat brain swelling, a common complication at extreme altitudes. However, full treatment required evacuation to lower altitudes. When Peach Weathers received word that Beck was still alive, the information was presented cautiously so as not to raise false hopes. However, she saw the situation differently. If Beck was able to stand up and walk to the camp, then he had a chance. An unprecedented rescue operation began. The South African expedition, which was at base camp and had not ascended on May 10th, helped coordinate communications. The IMAX team, which had abandoned the climb due to the weather, provided oxygen tanks and other resources for the survivors. But the key question remained: how to get Beck down the mountain? On May 12th, a Nepalese Army helicopter piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Madan Khatri Chetri was organized. Flying at such an altitude was considered virtually impossible. The thin air did not provide enough lift for the helicopter, and any change in weather could lead to disaster. This was the first attempt at a helicopter evacuation from an altitude of about 20,000 feet. Before the helicopter could arrive, Weathers had to be lowered to the landing zone. With the help of Sherpas and other climbers, he was transported down the Lhotse Wall, a process that took several hours due to his condition. The helicopter made 2 flights, first evacuating another casualty, Makoto Gao from the Taiwanese expedition, then returning for Weathers. The flight was on the verge of the possible. The pilot maneuvered in strong winds and thin air, at the limit of the aircraft's technical capabilities. Weathers was taken to a hospital in Kathmandu, where treatment for his frostbite and other injuries began. At the Kathmandu hospital, Beck received initial serious treatment, but the main treatment awaited him in Dallas. A medical examination confirmed the extent of the damage. Frostbite affected his face, nose, right arm, left arm, and both legs. The tissue necrosis was so deep that amputation was inevitable. When Weather returned to Dallas, he was greeted by his wife Peach and their children, Beck Jr. and Meg. Despite his disfigured face and bandaged hands, Peach hugged her husband and said the words that marked the beginning of their new journey. "You're home, and that's what matters." Meg rushed to her father's embrace, and 14-year-old Beck Jr., holding back tears, said, "Dad, I thought you weren't coming back." On the first night home, an important conversation took place with Peach, when she admitted that she had been preparing for a life without him. Over the next year, Weathers underwent more than 10 surgeries. Doctors amputated all 5 fingers on his left hand, half of his right arm below the elbow, and parts of both feet, requiring him to wear special orthopedic shoes. But the most difficult task was reconstructing his completely destroyed nose. In a unique procedure, surgeons used skin and cartilage from Beck's neck and ear to grow a new nose. They formed a skin flap on his forehead and gradually, while maintaining blood supply, transplanted it to the site of the missing nose. This process took several months and numerous operations, but in the end, Beck was able to regain not only functionality, but also an acceptable appearance. Physical rehabilitation went hand in hand with psychological transformation. Beck completely gave up mountaineering, realizing that his obsession had almost cost him not only his health, but also his family. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his relationship with his wife and children, spending more time with them and reevaluating his priorities. The tragedy of 1996 led to significant changes in high-altitude mountaineering practices. Stricter safety measures were introduced, strict adherence to turnaround times, improved weather forecasts, and mandatory additional oxygen supplies. Some companies, including the revived adventure consultants, began requiring clients to have proven high-altitude mountaineering experience. 8 lives were lost in that storm. Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, Doug Hansen, Yasko Namba, Andy Harris, and 3 Indian climbers who were ascending from the north side. Wathers wrote the book Left for Dead and became a motivational speaker, sharing his story with thousands of people. His speech is focused not so much on survival as on reevaluating values and the importance of human relationships. His key message is encapsulated in the words that have become a symbol of his incredible journey. Everest gave me more than it took away. I lost parts of my body, but I gained my family and a sense of purpose. Beck Weathers' story has gone far beyond the mountaineering community, becoming a universal metaphor for human resilience and transformation. In 2015, it was made into a movie called Everest, introducing millions of people to the drama that unfolded on the highest peak in the world. The tragedy of 1996 reminded everyone that mountain climbing is not just a sport or entertainment, but a serious challenge that requires a balance between ambition and safety. Everest remains a symbol of human aspirations, but also a harsh teacher whose lessons are sometimes paid for at the highest price. And Beck Weathers' lesson is perhaps the most important of all. The real summit is not a mountain, but the realization of what is truly valuable in life. Beck Weathers' story makes us think about the limits of human capabilities and what is truly important in life. But what if we look at these events from another angle? Was his choice to climb Everest at the expense of his family selfish, or is it a basic human need to test one's limits? Was Stuart Hutchison's decision to leave Beck and Yasko on the mountain ethical? Or do familiar moral rules cease to apply in extreme conditions? What would you choose if you were in Rob Hall's place? Stay with a dying client or save your own life, knowing that your pregnant wife is waiting for you at home? How far would you go to achieve your dreams? Stories like this don't just tell us about events from the past. They raise questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. If this story touched you, like it and subscribe to the channel. There are many more incredible stories ahead about human resilience, choices, and the consequences we have to live with. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episodes.